On May 22, 1917, in Memphis, Tennessee, a mob lynched an African American named L. Persons. Reports indicated that 5,000 people showed up that day to participate or watch. Persons was tied to a log, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. According to newspaper reports, his death was slow and agonizing. The crowd cheered as the smell of burnt flesh filled the air. After he died, they mutilated his body. Reading the story of Stephen, I can't help but think of Persons and the many other people who were lynched by mobs. Typically, Stephen is portrayed as the perfect martyr, the one who selflessly accepted his call to serve. But in this story, we also see that when Stephen's faith called on him to bear witness to the gospel, not everyone liked what he had to say. Being faithful got Stephen into trouble. But I've been thinking about the other characters in the story, like the people throwing stones at Stephen. These are not people we might expect to act this way. These are religious folks, and apparently they have a problem with who Stephen is. Before our text, back in Acts chapter 6, it seems Stephen's only crime is performing great wonders and signs among the people. The religious folks begin to argue with him, and then they decide to persuade some other folks to lie about him. And that's how he ends up before the council in our story. The overwhelming majority of the people at L. Persons' lynching were good church folks. They were people of faith. They even had a minister there, a man known as Brother Royal, who declined to pray for Persons, or to even allow Persons to pray for himself. I wonder how many lies people told in order for Persons to even be there that day. The other character in our story from Acts is Saul, who later, after his conversion on the road to Damascus, becomes the Apostle Paul. But as Saul, he doesn't throw any stones. He simply watches the coats of the ones who do throw stones. He doesn't get his hands dirty, but he sees what's going on. He doesn't yell and scream, but he hears the yells and screams. He doesn't do the deed, but he approves it. By standing by and doing nothing, Saul gives validity to what the mob's doing. He didn't throw the stones, but he knew what was happening and probably knew that it was wrong. He stood and watched and held the coats. Life is full of decisions, big and small, and we can't avoid making them. The decision to stand and do nothing but watch and hold coats is itself a decision. When we walk the tightrope, try to play the middle, or hide behind not making a decision, we do make a decision to watch and to hold the coats. The story of Stephen shows that we all stand in need of forgiveness and mercy. It also demonstrates something else we don't talk about a lot in our churches. Sometimes the mob wins, at least for the moment. Few people know his name. Few people know the name Michael Donald. He was also another African American lynched in Mobile, Alabama, in 1981. In 1981, I was 25 and about to get married. I was still naive enough to want to believe that crimes against black people for merely being black had ended. There were laws, right? There was public acceptance that people just couldn't do such things anymore, right? But that year, Donald was killed by a group of white men who admitted that they were out looking for a black person to kill. The local newspaper ran articles about the killing, as well as a picture of Donald hanging from the tree where his murderers left him. There are inherent dangers to living life as a person of color in the United States. Those dangers have their origin in the days when it was legal for black people to be disciplined, lynched, and reminded that they occupy a lower place in society. The segregationist laws that allowed that kind of discrimination were struck down, twice actually. When people who didn't like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution persisted in creating laws that devalue human lives, we tried again, an effort that led to the sweeping civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But over the years, we've learned that laws can't end the danger of living life as a person of color. The many lessons continue. In 1994, we learned about Nicholas Naquan Hayward Jr., a boy killed in Brooklyn while playing cops and robbers with a plastic orange-capped toy gun when a cop came across him and lifted his gun, a real one. Friends and neighbors reported that Nicholas dropped his gun and raised his hands. I'm only playing, he said. But before Nicholas had finished speaking, the police officer, Brian George, shot him in the stomach. 8 hours later, Nicholas was dead. We learned that Mr. Hayward holds a day of remembrance for his son every August and recounts the story of what happened to Nicholas, holding up a plastic toy gun with an orange cap. He's been retelling this story since the 90s in an effort to seek justice for the child he lost. We learned in 2012 that 17-year-old Trayvon Martin could be killed while walking down a Florida street because he looked like he didn't belong. We learned in 2014 that Eric Garner could be choked to death by a police officer in Staten Island for simply being suspected of selling cigarettes on the street. We learned in 2015 that Pastor Clementa Pinckney and 8 members of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, could be killed in their church simply after welcoming a young stranger into their Bible study. In 2018, we learned that Jasmine Abhulaman and her young child could be asked to leave their neighborhood pool in North Carolina because a neighbor who didn't recognize them determined they couldn't possibly belong there. While on the opposite coast, we learned that 91-year-old Rodolfo Rodriguez, a Mexican man legally visiting relatives in California, could be beaten with a concrete block by a passerby who demanded that he go back to his own country. We also learned that year that Botham Jean could be killed while sitting in his own apartment in Texas, bothering no one, because an off-duty police officer could just make a mistake. And this year we learned that Ahmaud Arbery could be killed while jogging in Georgia because someone who saw him as he passed by on his run decided that surely he must be a criminal. We also learned that Georgia officials could see nothing wrong with this and just let it go until an uproar was made all around the country. The shared history of people of European descent and people of color on this soil is a troubled one. It includes slavery and the subsequent laws that devalued human lives. It has bled into the reality of the separate and inherently unequal lives that we lead today. And for all 400 years that this land has been inhabited by people of European descent and people of color alike, there have been people of faith who have tried to justify separation and segregation. Some Christians have used the Bible to defend slavery and ideas of racial purity. But there's a difference between the Bible describing something and the Bible condoning it. The Bible acknowledges the sinfulness of our human hearts, our tendency to deny the image of God in other people, our unwillingness to follow the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. The Bible also contains instructions on holding one another accountable and reproving one another in love. The Jesus that Christians claim to follow frequently engaged in those behaviors, and he saw no one, not even the ones who ultimately would take his life, as being beyond God's mercy and love. Time slides by. I wonder how we can persevere sometimes, this tattered human family of love and cruelty and even despair. I can find myself in despair as well, but our gospel story today tells us we don't have to try and love all by ourselves. We don't have to do the impossible on our own. Jesus' desire is not that we wear ourselves out trying to conjure love from our own meager resources. His commandment is accompanied by a promise. Now, stop this recording and go to the next recording, the second half of our message.